Welcome back, everyone, to Enough Already. I'm your host, Lauren Craddock. And today we are going to have an honest conversation about what I think is one of the most important ideas of minimalism. And this idea does not get talked about a lot. I call it the perspective pivot. And it's a 3-part framework that I'm going to share with you today. So by the end of the episode, you will walk away with this 3-part framework in which you can implement right away and really begin to see transformation happen with minimalism in your life. I started my minimalist journey about 5 or 6 years ago. And prior to that, I tried everything that I knew as far as organizing, decluttering, anything I could find on the internet. I was hungry for any type of tip or trick that would help me eliminate the constant clutter cycle I found myself in. You know what I'm talking about, where you minimize something or you quote unquote declutter something, you get rid of something, and then all of a sudden your closets are overflowing again. And I found myself so frustrated that this was my life cycle, that I couldn't seem to break out of it. When I stumbled upon minimalism, my mind began to shift and my perspective began to shift about the way that I actually saw my items. So to illustrate the perspective pivot today, this 3-part framework that I'm going to share with you, I am going to share with you about my hobbies. So I am a very ambitious person. From a young age, I was always that high achiever. I wanted to make all A's. I was involved in so many different activities, from soccer, all-state flute. I participated in our youth group, our Bible drill competitions. I was an avid track runner, ran half marathons, and that was all just in middle school and high school. Fast forward to as a young adult, I began collecting hobbies. And I say that word collecting hobbies because I would start them and do them for a little while, and then they would end up on my shelf. So I explored with calligraphy and cross stitch, puzzles. I studied Spanish all the way through. So any type of Spanish book that I could get my hands on, I got. Not to mention, I was an avid scrapbooker in high school and college. And so when you put all of this together, you probably realize by now, all of those hobbies had very specific items that went with each activity. And what I found is that I would take these items from house to house when I moved, from shelf to shelf. But I didn't actually do most of these hobbies anymore. So this is what's going to take us to the very first step of our perspective pivot framework. The first step is to recognize the cost. So imagine with me a couple of shelves that are full of puzzles, scrapbooking materials, cleats for track and for soccer, all of the calligraphy pens, cross-stitch items, Spanish textbooks, you name it. I mean, imagine those 2 shelves just packed full. And they were right inside my clothes closet. And every time I walked past them, I felt this nagging guilt. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where you have something, you own something. At some point, it was a big part of your life. Maybe you used it often, but you don't anymore. And you feel this nagging guilt of, I should create time to do this. I should create time to use this item. So when I actually stepped back and I began evaluating my perspective about, well, what is this really costing me? Y'all, it was costing me way more than shelf space. All of these past hobbies, they were costing me peace of mind. They were causing this sense of guilt every time I walked past. And I didn't want to feel that way. I didn't want to live like that in this constant guilt cycle. And if I was really honest with myself, I didn't really want to do some of those activities anymore. But this brought me to the second part of the perspective pivot, in which you reveal the story. So in your mind, in your subconscious and your conscious, you are constantly telling yourself stories. Stories help you interpret the world around you. It helps you see yourself, whether truthfully or untruthfully, with the world around you. And this second step is almost a lot more difficult, in my opinion, than saying, hey, here's my cost. The cost was my shelf space, that nagging guilt, that peace of mind every time I saw those items. But this second step, it was asking me to identify belief, a story, and an identity that was actually keeping me stuck in this clutter cycle and this nagging. I literally moved from several houses with all of these items, and I didn't even use some of these items when I lived in those houses. So it was definitely time to let some of these items go, but I couldn't. And I was like, what is keeping me stuck? What story am I clinging to that I can't seem to let go of? So for me personally, regarding my hobbies, there were two stories that were keeping me stuck. The first one was this scarcity mentality of, if I get rid of it, I'm wasting it. Like, what if I need it someday? What if I decide that I'm going to run on a track team again? What if I decide that I need cross stitch in my life again? What if I decide that I want to start scrapbooking again? Then I'll have to buy all those new materials again. And isn't that a waste? Like, I won't have it if I need it. But I also found that I was even more deeply questioning, like, well, wasn't it a waste then of my time and my effort and all of those years that I was practicing these hobbies? If I get rid of my Spanish textbooks, like, was that a waste of my life? Was that a waste of my time to pour into studying another language? Was that a waste of time to spend all that time practicing soccer and building these skills and building that endurance? If I get rid of it, like, what does that say about me? Am I no longer the person that practices those things? And if I'm not, like, I just felt like a failure. And that's where that identity piece came in, is I felt like it wasn't just a waste of materials, but it was a waste of my life and my ability, and that somehow my identity would be a failure for getting rid of these things. And y'all, that's a heavy story to carry around. So when I began to really dig into that deeper, I spent some time journaling through it and figuring out, like, okay, if I get rid of these said items and I'm feeling this scarcity mentality and this failure identity over here, what can I do about it? And I realized that all of those things and all of that time committed to those hobbies, they weren't a waste. They created me into the person that I am today. All of that time that I spent practicing soccer and running and learning how to cross stitch or use the calligraphy pens, all of that time that I spent poring over memories and scrapbooking those memories, that wasn't a waste. It was teaching me endurance. It was helping me build habits of health and follow through even when it got hard. It was teaching me attention to detail and building my memory muscles and teaching me to appreciate other people through language and through experiences. And so none of those things were a waste. And when I was finally able to remind myself of that story, I was able to let go of these other two stories that no longer served me, because they were keeping me held back. I felt a relief to be able to let go that I don't have to go back and become a soccer player. I don't have to be an avid scrapbooker the rest of my life. Like, I can choose differently and I can choose to use my time differently now. And that doesn't mean it was a waste, and that doesn't mean that I'm a failure. It simply means that I'm taking those skills that I learned, and in this season of my life, I can choose differently. And that brings us to our third. So remember, the first one was revealing the cost, like, what was it costing me? And then secondly, that story, revealing the story. that I was telling myself. And then that third part of the framework for perspective pivot is choosing with intention. So choosing to go forward in a different way. So this third step, I believe, is just as important because it is creating the framework for your current season and where you want to go in the future. So I spent some time after I was able to release that story and begin to minimize some of those hobby items that I didn't need anymore and release those with gratitude for they served me for a season. But now I was able to sit down and brainstorm and say, okay, what do I really, truly want to use my time for? Like in this season of my life, as a mom of 3 boys, as a teacher, as a podcaster, as an author, like what do I want to spend my time doing? What do I enjoy doing? And when I brainstormed that, none of the previous hobbies came up. But at that point, I was able to let that go and be like, that's okay. I can choose differently. I want to be able to share this with you because I feel like when you're talking about minimalism, when people talk about decluttering or emptying their closets, they focus so much on the items and the clutter themselves. And they don't stop and analyze, well, what is it costing me? What story is happening in the back of my head? And then how can I choose a different story and choose a different way forward? I feel like that is super powerful. And that's where the transformation can actually happen. Because when you address that, your clutter cycle is going to change. You're not going to be stuck in those old stories anymore. Instead, when you begin to address the clutter or address the items that are in front of you, you can choose differently. Instead, as you begin to address the items in front of you, you then have the mental clarity and the fortitude and the skills you need to go forward and to address that clutter and address those items and choose for what fits in this particular season of your life. So that is why I talk so much to clients and people I work with about shifting their perspective. And I call it the perspective pivot because basketball term, okay, get ready, is when you pivot, you're standing on one foot still and you're turning your direction. You're recognizing, okay, what's blocking me? What's my cost, right? What story is in my way? And then how can I continue shifting and looking different directions until I find what's good for this season, until I can choose differently and go forward? And you're grounded in those core beliefs. You're not changing the identity and the core of who you are, but you are beginning to reevaluate what are those costs? What are those stories? What are those beliefs that I'm clinging to that is forming my life around me? Because I truly believe that clutter, it's not the main issue. It can be an issue, but it's not the main issue. It's a symptom for all of these costs and stories that are going on underneath. So I challenge you today to find an area in your home. I would say don't start with super sentimental items. And I wouldn't even start with the hobbies. I didn't even tackle my hobbies until I was several years into minimizing. Like I said, those hobby materials moved with me several houses before I felt like I had the muscles. I talk about the minimalist muscles and the ability to finally release some of those emotionally. So that's the perspective pivot in action, where you recognize the cost, you reveal the story, and then you choose intentionally, you choose differently. It doesn't focus specifically on the items. This happens prior to going in and saying, should I keep this? Do I use it? Do I like it? How much of it do I actually need? No, this work happens before you go and begin addressing some of these items. So my challenge for you this week is to find an area of your home, not a sentimental area, but find an area that, for example, a drop zone, a kitchen counter, a kitchen cabinet, someplace that doesn't have a lot of emotional attachment to it. But before you begin addressing that space, start by asking yourself, what is the clutter costing me? What beliefs or stories am I telling myself regarding these items? And then how can I choose differently? How can I choose what's relevant in this season of life? If this podcast resonated with you today, I ask you to share that with other friends because this is the foundation of minimalism. This is where we see massive transformation happen when you began addressing that cost and your stories in your life. Thanks for listening today to Enough Already, and I can't wait to have you back again.